Today I'm going to talk about the most important issue regarding the space development of a space economy, which is a rules-based order. Without that, we will make no progress. Several points of view are come together in this discussion. One is International Lunar Decade, an idea that was born in roughly 2006, the idea of something modeled on the International Geophysical Year. Another stream of thought is the Global Space Renaissance, which is an effort chaired by Jim Crisafulli. A third element is the Space Treaty Project, which is an effort by Dennis O'Brien and his organization, which is aiming at demonstrating that the Moon Treaty can be the basis for law for the utilization of space resources. And the third element and the inspiration for all of us is Professor Bernard Foyng, ESA scientist and the director of the International Lunar Exploration Working Group. Our vision in the long term is a global space renaissance that is enabled by industrial scale use of lunar and asteroid resources. This enables the emergence of a moon-Earth economy with expanded access to material resources for the use of industrial civilization. It also expands human potential, not just beyond one planet, but also wider vistas in all regards, which includes ultimately, of course, space settlement, whether the space settlements are free space colonies as projected in the 1970s by Gerard K. O'Neill, or possibly a Mars colony as now advocated by Elon Musk and others, or other options. And then there is the option of a space-based solar power, which has been advocated and worked on from the 70s. And it appears that this can be realized and it can have a dramatic impact on the environment, on the possibility of sustainable development, addressing climate change and other challenges. In our vision, we see benefit for all countries on Earth, including developing countries that do not have the technologies or the economic base at this point to reach the moon. It is very significant to include them, and it is also a mandate that is included in the Outer Space Treaty, Article 1, that even those countries that do not have the scientific and economic potential, that they derive benefits from space development. We are also looking at this effort increasing the capacity to address all global threats, whether they are pandemics, food security, climate change, asteroid impact, coronal mass ejection, and others. It also reduces the threat of military conflict. And military conflict threats are now rising due to the rise of nationalisms, populism, and also the other threats that aggravate those situations. The thing about outer space development is it strengthens long-term sustainable development. We're not looking at sustainable development enabled just by the limited resources of our planet, but also by the other cosmic bodies in our solar system and beyond. The failure to develop a rules-based order for outer space development weakens the capacity to address all global threats, again, whether it's climate change, natural disasters, pandemics, and the looming threat of war, as there are increasing efforts to militarize outer space. The stellar example of the impact of a rules-based order is the post-war rules-based order that emerged after the devastation of World War II, with the formation of the UN, World Bank, other institutions, and agreements, which enabled extraordinary global growth and lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The post-war rules-based order, however, is now under threat from populism and nationalisms that are reaching into the most powerful countries of the world. Returning to some specifics about outer space development, what we're looking at is the possibility of industrial development on the moon and, of course, asteroids and other cosmic bodies. Our present industrial civilization was built using Earth's materials. And some have pointed out that the moon has similar materials, so why bother going there all that distance to extract those when it's easier to get them here? Well, the thing is, in the long term, mining, manufacturing, and transport costs on the moon or from the moon will potentially be much lower than costs on Earth. So if activity is increasingly in outer space, the moon will become an increasingly advantaged site for manufacturing resources and many other things, because there's less environmental concerns, much lower gravity, and vacuum to make easier launch from the lunar surface. Given the achievement of low costs, space industrial development will soar, with the moon being a prime industrial location. A problem that must be addressed when talking about lunar and other outer space resources is where will be the markets? Without markets, the massive investments required in both the mining, processing, and transportation, there's no reason to make them. So even though we may have the technologies to extract water, metals, and other materials from the moon, unless there is a place to use these materials in very large quantities, it will not make any sense to push lowering their costs. The markets must be clear. Well, where the markets are likely to emerge are not on the Earth. We don't see, let's say, pulling trillion-dollar asteroids closer to the Earth and extracting diamonds or whatever may have driven some people to look at asteroid mining. What is really exciting about the moon is that materials can be extracted from the lunar surface, launched to low Earth orbit for manufacturing and assembly of satellites and space facilities in near-Earth orbits. This could include fuel depots, logistics facilities, and other logistics facilities, habitats such as tourism resorts, hospitals. All these can be built from lunar materials with minimal disturbance to the environment of the Earth. Additionally, and this has been talked about for many, many years, including including starting with Gerard K. O'Neill, is to build space-based solar power stations in Earth orbit to beam power to the Earth using lunar materials. A possibility that's probably in the longer term, but it really depends on what we'll discover on the moon and beyond, is lunar and asteroid high-value payloads, such as rare earths, to deliver directly to the Earth. With the increasing use of rare earths for electrical power and for autonomous cars and many other technologies, the presence of rare earths on the moon, which is known, may become a significant item for lunar mining. There are, of course, markets on the moon itself. There will be needed for large-scale energy systems for industrial operations on the moon. Another extremely important, and really in the long term as important as lowering costs of launch from the Earth to low Earth orbit and beyond, is lowering the costs of launch from the moon to Earth orbits. This problem can be addressed in many ways, but it is part of the system that has to be addressed to make industrial development of the moon sensible. And then, of course, there will be need for depots, fuel depots, other transmission facilities in orbits. And once this infrastructure is in place, then supplying Mars, this would be primarily again in industrial operations in Mars orbits, as well as other deep space locations, becomes thinkable. The delta V to reach Mars, a long trip, however, is not that much greater than the delta V to reach low Earth orbit from the moon using atmospheric the braking. So it's very possible that initial development of Mars will be done with lunar resources, because those will be much less costly than shipping comparable items from the Earth. The time frames to address these opportunities is actually coming up quite fast. To seriously reach the possibility of a outer space renaissance, global renaissance with ever larger opportunities, it's very important that the demonstration of economic feasibility and political capacity occur by 2030 or thereabouts, because otherwise the time frames stretch out too long, and because without economic feasibility demonstrated, the large investments that will be needed that require long-range planning will not have the political capacity behind them to make them possible, because initially most of the investment will be coming from governments where politics plays a major role. If we succeed in demonstrating economic feasibility of lunar resource use, then in the 2030s, 2040 timeframe, we could see pilot projects to extract resources from the moon. Certainly water has been proposed, but there are many other items that could be extracted from lunar resources. For one, Michael Turner has proposed lunar basalt fibers. Basalts are abundant on the lunar surface, and Basalts can be used, basalt fibers can be used to construct spacecraft, space habitats, and much more. They're very resistant to temperature. They have made heat shields for reentry of space vehicles. So and they're extremely strong. There have been proposals to use the basalt fibers for shielding of spacecraft from micrometeorites. Beyond 2040, given pilot projects have taken place and now we have proof of concept, and it's no longer enthusiasm, but it's really driven by other needs, including, of course, profit. We could see efflorescence of industrial development in outer space, and beyond 2050, at some point, the space economy would exceed the current Earth economy. There are vastly more resources, more energy available in the outer space environment, and we could assume that millions of people will eventually be working and living in facilities in outer space, again, as Gerard and Neil facilities, or colonies on Mars, possibly on Titan, and then possibly at some point, centuries from now, Venus might be terraformed. What are the primary determinants of success? The key determinant of success for space development is a rules-based order. This enables the emergence of the political capacity then to marshal the resources, whether they're intellectual resources, financial resources, working together, international, global cooperation to finance large-scale, long-term ventures in outer space that will take a very patient money. And but again, the foundation for that is a rules-based order because it enables long-range planning for investments and decision-making. This also enables the development of the necessary science and technological capacity to enable space development. So fundamental to everything is a rules-based order for space development. The foundation of a rules-based order for space development is the UN space treaties. Now, in the recent years, recent time, even recent months, we've had idle talk of some possibly of doing away with outer space treaty, which has been poo-pooed by business leaders in the United States in a hearing by Senator Cruz talking about space treaty. And now, more recently, there are other efforts to weaken or space treaties and to pursue more narrow goals, nationalism in space. There seemingly are two pathways forward at this time for outer space development. One pathway is to make the Moon Treaty work and become customary law and become the foundation for further development of outer space law. It has a defined pathway towards a rules-based order for space development. The process to achieve this is defined in the agreement itself. The Moon Treaty can also achieve the goals implicit in Article 1 of OST, and that is that it's the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon, other celestial bodies, is carried out for the benefit and in the interest of all countries irrespective of their economic and scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. Dennis O'Brien has defined this idea as defining a jurisdiction for mankind as the solar system and its resources. An option that has been discussed and attempted and now is becoming seriously proposed is to abandon the UN Moon Treaty, which does have 18 states parties and multiple other parties interested in becoming states parties, as well as 4 signatory countries. And the problem with abandoning the Moon Treaty is that it removes a clear pathway to a rules-based order for space development, which essentially has to follow UN space treaties. What abandoning the UN Moon Treaty does is it opens the door to nationalism in the space domain, and it increases the threat of possible military conflicts. Right now, we have efforts to develop space forces, talk of dominance of the outer space environment, increasing development of increasingly sophisticated weapons for outer space, and the possible destruction of space assets of various countries. If the Moon Treaty, along with all the other things, is abandoned, it may foreclose the possibility of a space renaissance, because that is dependent on the establishment of a rules-based order for outer space development. On April the 16th of this year, President Trump issued an executive order whose title talked about international cooperation regarding the moon and use of space resources. However, its primary purpose, as declared in the language itself, is aimed at preventing the Moon Treaty from becoming customary space law. What's included in the executive order is the pressure from the U.S. using the State Department and other agencies to pressure other spacefaring states, as well as the states parties to the Moon Treaty, to not abide by the Moon Treaty and rather to do something else. The problem is there is no other internationally accepted process for that. That would be simply a national initiative, sort of akin to the era before the United Nations. It would be an example of power politics played out in the outer space domain. The Artemis Accords, which are linked with the extraordinary project of reaching the moon, with the first woman landing on the surface of the moon in 2024, unfortunately, is envisioned also as a step towards implementation of this executive order, even though thus far published language does not identify or speak negatively of the Moon Treaty itself. That is in another arena. However, these two things were developed concurrently. They are linked. And so if the Artemis Accords can be delinked from the executive order, I believe they could be made to work and be consistent with the creation of a rules-based order. A key problem with the Artemis Accords is that they bypass the United Nations. There is no substantive involvement of UN COPUOS anticipated. There is a claim of adherence to the Outer Space Treaty, but no involvement by developing countries is anticipated. And also, there are attempts in the effort to bypass the Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the non-appropriation clause of the Outer Space Treaty, that sovereign states cannot take sovereign ownership of bodies in outer space. These matters need considerable discussion, but there is an assumption of the capacity of the U.S. to dominate the international community and to even dominate outer space. Such language has even been used. However, there is no nation on Earth that has the capacity to impose its order on the world or on outer space. A globally significant order, rules-based order, cannot be created outside of the UN framework. Adversaries as well as allies must be involved. No outer space regime can work that does not include both the US and China as equals. There is one clear pathway forward to the development of a rules-based order for space development, and that is to make the Moon Treaty work. There are no barriers to the US and China becoming signatories and states parties. There is no provision in the Moon Treaty that prevents any type of development that has been proposed by responsible leaders for use of the Moon's resources. What is prohibited, of course, is the militarization of the Moon, and that is necessary. An internationally approved process is defined in the treaty to modify the treaty itself to meet requirements, and it's even anticipated, and to develop the rules and procedures to govern use of outer space resources. Such a process has not been defined outside of the Moon Treaty. There is no form or process outside of the UN framework to negotiate a rules-based order for outer space. There have been attempts made to define the language, such as the Hague Space Resources Working Group, but unless this language is incorporated into a process negotiated within UN COPUOS, it has no meaning. It's useful, but ultimately no meaning. The steps to make the Moon Treaty work are quite simple. They're defined in Article 18 of the Moon Treaty. The Secretary General of the UN can convene a conference of the states parties to review the agreement. A review conference would also agree the question of the implementation of the provisions of Article 11, paragraph 5, which is the international regime, the rules for the use of lunar and other outer space resources. There is an alternative pathway, and that is the Secretary General could open the conference to the entire UN General Assembly, which may be appropriate at this stage, due to the importance of establishing a rules-based order for outer space development. Modification of the Moon Treaty was designed to be relatively easy. It was expected to be changed because the main negotiators, this was the United States and the Soviet Union, did not anticipated technological and political changes that the treaty would have to adapt to. So the language includes the expectation that within 10 years the terms of the treaty would be reviewed, and also within 5 years. So the state parties can make a decision. 1/3 of the state parties can propose a conference. If the majority approves, the conference takes place. A majority of the states parties can approve a change in the treaty. This is not UN COPUOS with its nearly 100 members. It is a much smaller body, much more focused on the narrow issue of lunar resources. So the easy way forward would be to convene the states parties to discuss how the treaty needs to be modified, as well as to start the development of the specific rules and procedures to govern the use of lunar resources. This process is likely to continue for decades to come. The Moon Treaty does not, in any fashion, prohibit making a profit from lunar resources. This is expected. In fact, it is assumed in the guidelines to guide the development of the rules for use of lunar resources that the use of lunar resources, the opportunities will be expanded. Expansion can only occur with investment. Investment can only make sense if there's profit. So the assumption is there can be profit in the very rules, in the principles to guide the rules to govern space development. The use of lunar resources cannot be limited to the questions, legal questions, technological and others, of processing lunar materials. You must also address the markets. If the markets are not clear, then the use of lunar resources will not emerge, and there will be very limited markets for use of lunar resources on the moon itself for quite some time. The markets will be in near-Earth orbits. Therefore, when addressing the rules for use of space resources to enable a space economy to emerge, then space traffic management for lunar launch, aerobraking of spacecraft to near-Earth orbits has to be addressed concurrently or as part of the same package. There needs to be a regime to govern near-Earth orbital facilities for manufacturing and assembly, habitats, tourism, logistics, fuel depots, and other needs. This has to be addressed concurrently with the rules to extract the resources from the moon or asteroids or other bodies. So the question is quite large and involves many, many aspects. So it's not simply something, philosophical issues as to whether we can somehow evade the non-appropriation clause in the Outer Space Treaty. It becomes much greater. We need to address traffic logistics, traffic management, market creation, and so forth. There's much more to say about these issues from the various perspectives represented by the contributors to this presentation. I would urge you to contact each one of them to pursue your own interests. And again, my focus has been on demonstrating the feasibility of economic use of lunar resources through the International Lunar Decade. Jim Crisafulli is coordinating the Global Space Renaissance Initiative, and which includes notable people from the United States, Europe, and elsewhere. And Dennis O'Brien has developed the idea of an implementation agreement for the Moon Treaty, and he heads the Space Treaty Project, and he has a wealth of information on that, and he needs to be contacted. Bernard Foing is our inspiration. He has broken ground on this issue for decades, and we look to him for inspiration and contact him to join the effort with the International Lunar Exploration Working Group and other efforts. Thank you very much.